Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Populist Temptation, Economic Grievance and Political Reaction in the Modern Era, by Barry Eichengreen. Narrated by Rick Adamson. Publisher's Note: in this audio edition, you may hear references to visual elements present in the print and ebook formats of the book. Preface. Populism is a new phenomenon, but also a very old one. This is most visibly true in the United States, where what is referred to as the populist revolt occurred in the 19th century. But it is also true of Europe, where charismatic leaders with anti-establishment, authoritarian, and nationalist tendencies, from Benito Mussolini to Yannis Metaxas, captured the popular imagination, or at least the levers of power, in the 1920s and 1930s. Whether these specific individuals should be identified as populist is debatable. Charisma, for one thing, is in the eye of the beholder, as Max Weber reminded us. More fundamentally, there is the question of whether populism as a concept is well defined. But to the extent that there is something afoot in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Europe that involves the reaction of voters against the political establishment, nationalist and racialist sentiment directed against foreigners and minorities, and a yearning for forceful, charismatic leadership, this something, whatever we call it, is not new. By looking back at the history of the United States and Europe, I hope to identify the economic, social, and political circumstances under which populism takes hold, and the policies that most effectively combat it. I seek to determine why radical political movements with anti-elite, authoritarian, and nativist tendencies succeed at some times, but not others. I hope to understand why in some cases the center held, while in others political extremists carried the day. Historical comparisons are powerful but perilous. A focus on extreme cases lends itself to exaggeration, and parallels can be overdrawn. Today is not the 1930s. By acknowledging differences and considering instances where a populist reaction was contained, as well as those where populist leaders and movements usurped power, I hope to avoid the worst pitfalls. The answers matter. The characteristic economic policies of populist leaders are damaging and destructive, and the impact of populists on political institutions is corrosive. The attitudes they animate bring out the worst in their followers. Populism arrays the people against the intelligentsia, natives against foreigners, and dominant ethnic, religious, and racial groups against minorities. It is divisive by nature. It can be dangerously conducive to bellicose nationalism. The history recounted here suggests that populism is activated by the combination of economic insecurity, threats to national identity, and an unresponsive political system, but that it can be quelled by economic and political reforms that address the concerns of the disaffected. A first step is for policymakers to do what they can to reinvigorate economic growth, giving young people hope that their lives will be as good as those of their parents, and older people a sense that their lifetime of labor is respected and rewarded. Populist revolts rarely arise in good economic times, in other words. Equally important is that the fruits of that growth be widely shared, and that individuals displaced by technological progress and international competition are assured that they have social support and assistance on which to fall back. Assuring them starts with acknowledging that there are losers as well as winners from market competition, globalization, and technical change, something that economists are taught at an early age, but which they have a peculiar tendency to forget. It continues with acknowledging that economic misfortune is not always the fault of the unfortunate. It concludes by putting in place programs that compensate the displaced and by providing education, training, and social services to help individuals adjust to new circumstances. This is not a novel formula, but if its elements are commonplace, they are no less important for that. Commonplace, however, is not the same as straightforward. Modern societies show disturbingly little capacity to respond in this way. They struggle to develop a political consensus around the desirability of implementing and, no less important, adequately financing programs that compensate the displaced and help them adjust to new circumstances. In turn, this points to a second source of populist disaffection, namely the dysfunctionality of the political system. Here, the relevant institutions include the electoral system, the legislature, the civil service, the courts, but also civil society and the Fourth Estate. Their structure shapes the responsiveness of government, which is the ultimate measure of whether the citizenry has a voice. Political institutions are also a key ingredient of political stability, and hence of the capacity of society to pursue policies making for growth and an equitable distribution of its fruits. Suitably designed, they give voters and candidates for office an incentive to move to the political middle. They help cultivate a social and political consensus for prevailing policies, which in turn makes for stability, economic and political both. But those institutions can also provoke dissatisfaction and incite a political reaction when they fail to deliver the goods. The problem is that political institutions are not malleable. By design, they are hard to alter, precisely in order to prevent the players from changing the rules in the middle of the game. The institutional inheritance will therefore reflect the imperatives of the past. For instance, the peculiar history of the United States, notably the historical division between free and slave states, bequeathed an electoral college and a bicameral legislature whose upper chamber gives disproportionate voice to rural interests, accentuating the rural-urban divide that figured prominently in Donald Trump's election in 2016. By delegating to state legislatures the power to draw congressional district lines, this legacy has encouraged the creation of safe districts whose occupants have little incentive to move to the middle. A history of institutionalized racism, institutionalized by political means, has bequeathed a legacy that continues to limit trust, complicating efforts to agree on the provision of public goods. This inheritance is one reason the United States has a less elaborate social insurance state than other advanced economies, rendering it particularly susceptible to a backlash from individuals displaced by changes in technology and globalization. Reform of these institutions, while easy to imagine, is hard to accomplish. Hard, though, is not the same as impossible. In the early 20th century, the populist revolt was quieted by political reforms, including the direct election of senators and referendum processes that allowed voters to bypass captured and corrupt state legislatures. More recently, states have sought to address gerrymandering by delegating the drawing of congressional district lines to independent commissions. But given the country's history and consequently its current political configuration, more fundamental reforms such as of the Electoral College are beyond the pale. If the challenge facing the United States stems from America's distinctive national identity, then the challenge for Europe is the absence of a European identity. The European Union, EU, was Europe's response to 3 wars in less than a century. It was most visibly an economic project, a framework for fostering stability and growth that, by preventing economic disasters like those of the 1930s, would remove the basis for an anti-establishment, authoritarian, nationalist revolt. But at a deeper level, it was a political project, since it was necessary to provide for the accountability of those making decisions for the continent as a whole. Creating a single market, the argument went, would highlight the need for shared oversight and governance of the common European space. A true single market would require an antitrust or competition authority to prevent the abuse of monopoly power. It would require an anti-subsidy or anti-state aid authority to prevent favoritism of national champions and ensure a level playing field. Carrying out those tasks would require the creation of European institutions, and through the creation of European institutions and the day-to-day process of shared governance, deeper integration, and ultimately a common European identity would emerge. But that European identity, in practice, has been slow to develop, national identities being deeply rooted. In its absence, there has been a hesitancy to cede significant prerogatives to European institutions. There has been reluctance to delegate meaningful powers to the European Parliament, the body of EU-wide elected representatives. Key decisions are taken in intergovernmental negotiations by European heads of state, meeting as the European Council, or Eurogroup, in a process that highlights differences between countries instead of moderating them. Accentuating those differences makes it hard for EU members to agree on policies that foster growth with equity, giving populist politicians an economic platform on which to stand. And where there has been a willingness in practice to delegate powers to entities like the European Commission, the EU's proto-executive branch, its members are perceived, not unreasonably, as unaccountable technocrats, given the absence of a European polity to hold the bureaucrats in question fully accountable for their actions. One can imagine modifying these political arrangements, for example, strengthening the powers of the European Parliament and directly electing the President of the Commission. But even if the history of the EU is shorter than the history of the United States, the institutional inheritance again stands in the way. Not just are the EU's institutions a product of the continent's peculiar history, but they are embedded in a set of international treaties whose modification requires unanimous consent, something that is even less likely than getting 3/4 of U.S. states to agree on a constitutional amendment changing the Electoral College. And the absence of those reforms, whose proponents struggle to overcome the shadow of history, renders the EU a prime populist target. The present book, which elaborates these themes, is prompted by the rise of European populism, by the victory of Leave in the UK referendum on EU membership, and by the election of Donald Trump. But many of the ideas it elaborates arose already in my earlier writing. In Golden Fetters, The Gold Standard and the Great Depression, 1992, I described the policy choices that led to economic and social breakdown in the 1930s and traced their roots to political institutions that gave rise to unstable governments, perverse and inconsistent policies, and political reaction. A subsequent book, The European Economy Since 1945, Coordinated Capitalism and Beyond, 2007, was an attempt to describe the historical origins of the European Union, the nature and limits of European identity, and the rise and fall of the mixed economy. My recent book, Hall of Mirrors, The Great Depression, the Great Recession, and the Uses and Misuses of History, 2015, was an effort to show how politics sets the stage for financial crises, how those crises fuel political extremism, and how history shapes the response, for better and worse. But this work differs from that earlier work in that the questions are more fundamentally political, although the answers remain heavily economic. Those answers are also fundamentally historical. Viewing developments in a historical light directs an author's attention not just to deep economic and political structures, but also to historical contingency, to chance events, personalities, and human agency. I am conscious that a historical perspective also conduces to a kind of fatalism, to the sense that inherited political arrangements, social structures, and economic institutions render some countries more susceptible to populist reactions and leave them less scope for mounting a constructive response. As someone who likes to think of himself as reasonably optimistic, I do my best to resist that kind of fatalism, concluding this book with some ideas for how the United States and Europe should respond to the populist threat. Thanks go to Joshua Lustig, who commissioned for Current History, the journal that he edits, an essay on the history of populism in the United States. That essay provided the spark for the rest of the book. I acknowledge the permission of Current History to reprint material from that earlier piece. Along the way, I have received helpful comments and learned much from collaborators and friends, many of whom are of course one and the same, among them Tam Bayumi, Seth Ditchik, Christian Dustman, Michael Haynes, Matthew Jaremski, David LeBlanc, Ashoka Modi, Andre Sapir, Guido Tabellini, and Gilfi Zioga. I thank Johnny Toniolo and Nicholas Dimsdale for help with country-specific information. Asha Sekar Bharadwaj assisted with data and graphics. My editor, David McBride, and 2 anonymous referees for Oxford University Press provided invaluable comments. Andrew Wiley made placing the book as painless as possible. Alison Rice Swiss helped with preparing the index and more generally kept my office and life running smoothly. Seminar audiences provided spirited feedback, notably at the American Academy in Berlin, the University of California at Davis, the Belgian Consulate in Washington, D.C., and the European Central Bank. I am grateful to them all. This book is dedicated once more to Michelle for all her love and support. 1. The Populist Archetype. Efforts to define populism remind one of Justice Potter Stewart's definition of pornography. I know it when I see it. The awkward fact is that there is no agreed definition. Populism is a multidimensional phenomenon with multiple perspectives on each dimension. To each his own definition, according to the academic axe he grinds, wrote the political economist Peter Wiles half a century ago. Here, I define populism as a political movement with anti-elite, authoritarian, and nativist tendencies. Since populist movements combine these tendencies in different ways, there are different variants of the phenomenon. In particular, there are populist movements of the left, which emphasize the anti-elite element, and of the right, which emphasize hostility toward foreigners and minorities. At the most basic level, populists divide society into the elites and the people. The elites control government, business, and banking, reproducing themselves through favored access to education, the executive suite, and higher echelons of the public sector. Superficial differences notwithstanding, they form a united front. There is little difference, for example, in the backgrounds and interests of the families and networks controlling the major political parties. It follows that there is little difference, in the populist conception, in the policies they espouse. Populists invoke these notions to advance the idea that mainstream politics is an elite conspiracy that produces results inimical to the interests of the people. Politicians prospered, but the jobs left and the factories closed. The establishment protected itself, but not the citizens of our country. Their victories have not been your victories. Their triumphs have not been your triumphs, was how President Donald Trump put it in his inaugural address. The people may lack the education of the elite, but they possess a basic common sense, passed down through collective traditions, religion, and community, to which populist politicians can appeal. Virtue resides in the simple people, who are the overwhelming majority, and in their collective traditions, to again quote Peter Wiles. Populist politics is, then, the process by which the general will, informed by this common sense, is translated into policy. But who exactly constitute the people is easier said in theory than in practice. In 19th century America, members of the agrarian movement, comprising Midwestern wheat farmers and Southern cotton growers, faced the dilemma of whether to ally with disaffected factory workers and vice versa. In Donald Trump's America, the candidate sought to broaden his base by appealing not just to blue-collar workers left behind by technological change and globalization, but also to a middle class concerned about the decline of traditional American values. One way of resolving these ambiguities is by defining the people in opposition to the other. In 19th century America, the other was identified as financiers, railroad barons, and industrialists who gained great wealth by exploiting honest, hard-working farm and factory workers. The unity and homogeneity of the people were further defined by the exclusion of visible minorities like indentured Chinese labor and so-called new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. This same definition by opposition is prevalent in other populist movements. The hostility of populist politicians to not just concentrated economic power, but also immigrants and racial and religious minorities, thus is intrinsic to the movement. Viewing society this way breeds an instinctual antagonism to technocrats and governmental agencies. Technocrats are members of the elite by definition. They use privileged information and preferential access to achieve their objectives. Agencies of government staffed by technocrats, by virtue of their statutory independence and the complexity of their procedures, are remote from the people. Populist politicians regularly impugn the integrity of central bankers, those most technocratic of technocrats, and question the independence of their institution. The Federal Reserve System, together with its early American progenitor, the Bank of the United States, has been a favorite target of politicians with populist leanings, from Andrew Jackson in the 19th century to Huey Long in the 20th and Donald Trump in the 21st. In the run-up to the 2016 referendum on whether the United Kingdom should leave the European Union, UK Independence Party leaders like Nigel Farage similarly appealed to voters by criticizing the integrity and competence of EU technocrats and demanding that decision-making power be restored to the British people. Populism thus favors direct over representative democracy, insofar as elites are disproportionately influential in the selection of representatives. It favors referenda over delegating power to office holders who can't be counted on to respect the will of the people. The pioneering referendum processes adopted in Oregon, California, and other Western states at the turn of the 20th century, in which citizens could petition to place questions on the ballot and pass them by simple majority vote, were part of a populist revolt against corruption and a political establishment dominated by large corporations and other powerful interests. The Oregon referendum and initiative movement, championed by William Simon Uren, for example, was immediately informed by these concerns. Referendum Uren, as he was known, mobilized the Farmers' Alliance and trade unions, the two principal sources of support for the Populist Party, of which he was Oregon State Secretary, in support of the referendum law adopted in 1902 as a way of making an end run around what he and his followers saw as corrupt politicians, unresponsive elites, and self-aggrandizing railroad monopolies, classic populist tropes all. This value imputed to the will of the people is also a way of understanding why Donald Trump attached such importance to the idea that he would have won the popular vote for the presidency in 2016 but for pervasive and widespread voter fraud. In the case of the Brexit referendum, supporters of Leave defended the outcome on analogous grounds. The result reflected the will of the people. The Brexit campaign was visibly tinged by anti-elite, anti-expert rhetoric, with supporters seeking to discredit the view of professional economists and others that leaving the EU would have significant costs. As Michael Gove, Justice Secretary in the soon-to-be former Cameron government and leading supporter of Leave, put it in a television debate, people have had enough of experts. Populism is also a political style. Candidates portray themselves as no-nonsense leaders prepared to knock sense into establishment figures unwilling to address society's urgent needs, an intention they communicate using harsh, unconventional words and tactics. Disregarding the niceties of political convention is a way of demonstrating independence and force of personality. Political incorrectness and off-color language are ways of signaling seriousness of purpose and speaking directly to the people. In the extreme, forcefulness is conveyed by the assertive dismissal of inconvenient facts and a menacing undercurrent of violence. Populist politicians regularly rely on new technologies to circumvent channels of communication controlled by mainstream parties and convey their views directly to their followers. As Michael Conniff wrote of Latin American populism 2 decades ago, skillful use of new media is an important attribute of populists. In Latin America in the 1920s and the United States in the 1930s, radio played an important role in disseminating populist views, bypassing the establishment press. Decades earlier, in his 1896 campaign for the U.S. presidency, William Jennings Bryan, the candidate of the Democratic and Populist parties, made unprecedented use of the railway, a revolutionary transportation and communications technology if there ever was one, delivering more than 600 speeches directly to the people. Bryan raised few funds, made little use of pamphlets and other conventional political media, and leaned only lightly on the Democratic National Committee for campaign support. There was no little irony in Bryan's reliance on the railway, since he consistently criticized it as exemplifying corporate abuse of monopoly power. But no matter. Bryan's campaign similarly made unprecedented use of the telegraph to schedule and publicize his appearances. His Cross of Gold speech at the 1896 Democratic National Convention made such a splash partly because the telegraph was used to transmit his message nationally, rather than relying on reports by newspaper correspondents and their publishers, many of whom were hostile to his candidacy. Bryan's strategy was in contrast to that of William McKinley, the candidate of the Republican Party establishment, who remained firmly planted on his front porch. McKinley drew, successfully in the event, on the ample financial and organizational resources of the National Republican Party and its chairman, Dollar Mark Hanna. The mainstream Republican newspapers were also firmly in McKinley's camp. For an outsider like Bryan, competing with a generously financed establishment candidate, new technology was the only option. If McKinley triumphed in the end, Bryan's approach exemplified populist tactics. Later, in the mid-20th century, populists in Latin America and elsewhere used small planes to bring their message directly to the people, again circumventing established media channels. The 21st century variant is, of course, Donald Trump's use of Twitter for bypassing traditional print media and communicating directly with voters. In his reliance on Twitter, Trump was unwittingly following the precedent of another exemplar of the populist temperament, Venezuela's Hugo Chavez. Meanwhile, cable television channels, satellite radio talk shows, and alt-right internet websites undermined control by the political mainstream and party establishment of news flow and political narrative. Resort to these new technologies and outlets enabled Trump, like his populist predecessors, to disintermediate the establishment media and disable its interpretive influence. A further dimension of populism is its characteristic economic policies. Rudiger Dornbusch and Sebastian Edwards, drawing on Latin American experience, define populism as an approach to economics that emphasizes distribution.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?